So we just saw how we can get from the assumption of sticky prices to our short-run aggregate supply curve. In this video, we're going to change a bunch of those same assumptions and actually still get to the same short-run aggregate supply curve. We're now going to assume in this imperfect information model that all prices are completely flexible, that firms can increase and decrease prices as they need to, and thus all markets are able to clear. We're also going to assume that every supplier only produces one good, but everybody can consume many goods. And we're going to assume that suppliers know the nominal price of their good, but they don't really know what the overall price level is. Now this kind of makes sense, because usually the overall price level isn't released until after the fact. Inflation for the first quarter of 2020 won't be released until at least April, well after the first quarter of 2020 ended. And so the supply of every good is going to depend specifically on that good's relative price, the nominal price of the good divided by the overall price level. And so if the overall price level is really, really high, chances are the relative price of the good is going to be fairly low. It's cheap compared to all of the other goods in the economy. But the supplier doesn't know the overall price level when they make their production decision. So they have to form some kind of expectation for what the price level is going to be. Somewhat similar to the sticky price model. And so if we find the price level rises, but the expected price didn't. So suddenly inflation is very high, but we didn't really think inflation was going to be very high. Producers will see that the price for their good has risen, and they're going to produce more in response. They won't know if that increase in price comes from more people wanting their good or simply a rise in prices throughout the entire economy. But it really won't matter because producers will respond to this higher price by producing more, thus increasing output. And so when prices rise, in this case, above expectation, output will go up. And so we can take all of this and put it back on our aggregate supply and aggregate demand graph, and it's going to look the same regardless of the assumptions we make. Regardless of if we assume sticky prices or flexible prices, we're going to have that same short-run aggregate supply curve. And so we still have a perfectly vertical long-run aggregate supply curve. That hasn't changed. We developed the theory for that in the first half of the class. And that's going to happen at y bar. But now we have this upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. And the equation for that is exactly the same regardless of the assumptions we make. That y is equal to y bar plus alpha times p minus EP. And so the price level is going to be exactly the expected price level where the short run and the long run aggregate supply curves intersect. And so right at that point, P is equal to EP. When prices rise well above expected price, if P is greater than EP, like in this region, we can see that output will be well above potential. But on the other side of that, if prices are well below expected price, if P is less than EP, then output will be well below potential, like in this region. And so thus, we have this simple upward sloping short-run aggregate supply curve. And we can see how this interacts with changes in aggregate demand, just like we had seen in previous chapters. Clear that off. let's assume that we're starting fairly close to equilibrium. For some reason, let's say that aggregate demand suddenly increases. So aggregate demand shifts to the right from AD1 to AD2. So we began at Y bar and price level P1. And P1 occurred right where we thought it would. Okay, but when aggregate demand rose, we didn't really expect that to happen. And so we'll have to respond by increasing output. And because we have this positively sloped short-run aggregate supply curve now, that increase in output is going to come with an increase in prices. This increase in aggregate demand surprised everybody, so they responded by increasing output, and thus the price level rose. In the sticky price model, flexible price firms would have increased their price. In the imperfect information model, firms would have simply responded by increasing prices, not knowing if that's an economy-wide phenomenon or if there's just more demand for their goods. But over time, that aggregate supply curve is still going to have to be the force that brings us back to our long-run equilibrium. Basically, we're going to have to shift the short-run aggregate supply curve back to the left to bring us back to our long-run equilibrium. And so we're going to shift from SRAS1 to SRAS2. That's going to bring us back to our long-run potential output, or long-run aggregate supply. People are going to change their expectations. And so price level P3 is going to be back to expected price, EP3. So aggregate to the right. Led to that initial short-run fluctuation in output, that initial increase in output from Y bar to Y2. And it also led to this short-run increase in the price level from P1 to P2. But because aggregate supply had to bring us back to our long-run potential, this rightward shift in aggregate demand also led to a long-run increase in the price level from P2 to P3. We converged back to our long-run aggregate supply at this new higher price level P3. And so regardless of the assumptions we make, whether we assume sticky prices or imperfect information, aggregate demand shifts can still have really significant impacts in both the short run and the long run on prices. And so this short run change in aggregate demand, the short run shift to the right, led to a short run fluctuation in our output. We ran above potential for a little while, but eventually we had to come back to our long run potential, our long run aggregate supply, and that occurred because our price level rose and our short run aggregate supply curve shifted to the left to bring us back to our long run equilibrium.